everyone. Welcome to our latest edition of ELI on Air, the ELI Talks broadcast, in which we speak to interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about big ideas of Jewish religious engagement, Jewish literacy, and Jewish identity. My name is Miriam Brousseau, and I'm the program director of ELI Talks. Really excited to be here today with Rabbi Jessy Gross and Mark Edelson, who are going to be talking with us today about Jessy's amazing ELI talk. Addressing Mishkan Judaism and Temple Judaism and the way that the world is changing and how the Jewish community can shift along and be strong and amazing as we go forward. Just a couple of notes before we jump into the conversation. First of all, we would love to hear your comments and questions along the way. Please feel free to submit those via Twitter using hashtag ELI Talks, and we'll keep an eye on that stream and bring in those questions to the conversation as they come up. And as always, this conversation is being simultaneously live streamed and recorded. So as soon as it's wrapped up, Talks broadcast in which we speak to interesting with the rest of the world about big ideas of Jewish religious engagement, Jewish literacy, and Jewish identity. So either Jessy or Mark, you have the video playing in the background.
I got it. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. All right, everyone. So with that, we'll jump right in. And I'm just going to ask, first of all, Jessy and Mark, thank you so much for taking the time out and being here with us for this conversation today. I'm really excited to be speaking with you. Jessy, can we kick off with a quick synopsis of your talk for any of the 4 or 5 people out there who may not have seen it yet?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just explain it real quickly, I guess, in 2 pieces. The thrust of the talk was a suggestion that, as we know, we are in a different mode of societal life in the way that we do business in the world at large. And so that has implications for how we think about building community and how we think about building Jewish community specifically. As we move into a different era of societal life, how will we make Judaism and Jewish tradition relevant? So the way that I launched the talk was really to be able to start to think about the way that we've kind of dealt with Jewish community in the recent decades in American Jewish life, and thinking about some of the behavioral and social changes in terms of trends and behaviors and how they are shifting, and how that invites us actually in some ways in a scary way, but in other ways in a really exciting way, to think about what are the other ways that Judaism presents to us different models for how to think about building community when the game changes a little bit. So I used the example of Temple Judaism, most traditionally the example of when the temple stood in Jerusalem as a pilgrimage destination for the people to go and make their offerings, and I juxtaposed that with the example of Mishkan Judaism, which was the model of Judaism that the Israelites who wandered in the desert used in order to build community. And I'll just name, I think, what are some specific differences between those two very quickly, and then just share what I think are the 3 attributes of Mishkan Judaism that I think are really relevant for us to think about as we're thinking about building Jewish community in the 21st century and looking forward into kind of the direction we think we're headed if Judaism and Torah are to be relevant for us, mostly thinking about Generation Xers and Millennials and those folks who are kind of coming up in the ranks. Specifically, Temple Judaism I used to think about an era of Judaism in which you had a physical destination that you went to in order to practice Judaism. In the traditional model, the temple being the temple in Jerusalem, but also in the most recent decades of American Judaism, thinking about, for the most part, we've gone to the temple to do our Jewish business and to build community there. And in generations previous to us, I would even say there was a clause that whether the synagogue was a place where you felt like you had a meaningful connection or not, you joined a synagogue because that's what Jews do. I think that that's not necessarily the basic operating assumption, especially of my peer group, and so being an allocated destination that has to spend a great deal of time and investment thinking about the purpose of the temple and how to build Jewish community and connection around that, and a place that as a result has a lot of other things to think about in addition to just cultivating a sense of spiritual connection to God and to other Jewish people, and what is the kind of daily practice and resonance of what the community is supposed to do together. That's in contrast to what I called Mishkan Mishkan Judaism, which is really the model that was used traditionally right before the temple was built in Jerusalem. But in this case, I think it kind of follows this next trend that we're coming out of and going into. Given that we are a more mobile people, given that especially among my peer generation, we're less committal, we have a variety of options, and we're kind of the first generation to come up that's hardwired to be able to code switch constantly, which I think drives my mother a little bit crazy, so I can't imagine it doesn't drive a bunch of other people in her generation a little bit crazy. And it leaves us with a lot of questions about what's going to happen to this Jewish model that most of us grew up in. The purpose of the talk was to try and offer that this isn't the first time that the Jews and Jewish tradition has had to figure out how to fit into a different model. And the Mishkan model was a model that was used when the Israelites were wandering in the desert from Egypt to the Promised Land with nothing more than the hope that they would actually arrive at a place where they could physically and spiritually root themselves in the ground. But during those 40 years of wandering in the desert, they still needed a spiritual center. And the Mishkan was flexible and mobile in that it moved along with the people for the journey. It created a different sense of relationship between Amcha, the people at large, and the leadership. And I think that it is a great starting place for us to think about in a more mobile, flexible time for a lot of people, especially among my peers and the generations that are coming up after us, to think about how do we make Judaism and Torah relevant in our lives. So the three attributes, and we can talk about this more, I'll just kind of name them for right now, that I think are really important for us if we want to draw on the Mishkan model to think about building Jewish community in the 21st century are the preparedness to be in a period of constant change, that we're ever changing. We kind of live in this time where we just expect that the next update to the greatest thing is already developed, even if it's not on the market, and trying to adjust to that when we've kind of had this, you know, stake in the ground, we're here to stay approach to Jewish life is something that we really need to consider as we're thinking about this kind of model switch or fluctuation. The second being space versus place. What does it mean if all of a sudden we don't depend on a sanctuary that we physically go into in order to cultivate, one, our own sense of spirituality, but also our own understanding of Jewish identity and Jewish knowledge? And how do we negotiate that? Can you go into a bar? Or can you go into a coffee shop and have the same profound transformative experience as opposed to if you're going into the synagogue? I think there's a lot of discussion there. And the third being leadership for change. And I'll just say about that, you know, in the temple model, there was a little bit of a different kind of understanding of the role that the leadership was to play as intermediaries between the people and God, and some of that leadership was really built on the idea that the temple had a purpose to serve, and therefore the leadership, in addition to serving as intermediaries between the people and God, had to serve the functions of the temple, and that was probably an active, ongoing, central conversation. I believe that the community organizing model and thinking about how to be among the people is a different kind of leadership mode that I know the seminaries are thinking about. I feel like I'm very much not alone in the fact that I'm oriented this way, but I do think when we're talking about making inroads in Jewish communal life as we make generational shifts, that thinking about a different style of leadership and a different way of understanding what leadership looks like is definitely a part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. And for anyone who hasn't seen the talk, I encourage you to check it out. It's really rich and really informative, has lots of great examples of what Jessy's talking about. Great conversation piece around your professional tables or with your volunteer group. And for those of you who may be just joining us, I'll remind you that if you do have questions or comments as we're going through this conversation, feel free to share them on Twitter using hashtag ELI Talks, ELI Talks, and we will share those comments and questions as we go through this conversation. But I'd love to throw it over to Mark. Can you say a little bit, first of all, about who you are and your role in the community, and maybe share some reactions to Jessy's talk? What stood out to you? What kind of insights did you take away? Anything that you disagree with, for instance?
Sure. That last point might be tough. I can tell you that Jessy and I don't disagree on a whole lot. So again, I just want to say thanks so much, Miriam, for having me, and Jessy for inviting me to be here for this discussion. My name is Mark Edelson. I am a lawyer in Baltimore City. I have lived in the city for about 8 years now. I'm originally from South Africa, and I have lived in the U.S. for almost 16 years at this point. And I came from an upbringing that was very much Temple Judaism focused. In South Africa, the way the community is there, it's very much focused around shul, the activities at the shul. I went to Jewish day school that was at the shul. The entire community was there on a Friday night. Most of the community was there on a Saturday morning for Shabbos services for both. And pretty much everything flowed through what was a combination of the school and the shul for the community. And that was sort of how life was. And I think in sort of a smaller, tightly knit community like that, you can have a lot of success that way. And it was a wonderful community and an amazing upbringing for me. So I think I'm in an interesting position, because while I fully appreciate the importance of Mishkan Judaism as it relates to the society that we live in, and that if we don't be a part of the change, we're going to get left behind, my traditional upbringing is very much tied to Temple Judaism, and I am very closely tied to that myself, because I loved every minute of my childhood. And so I think that I'm in a very interesting position in that I sort of sit on both sides of that fence. What I can tell you is that as a young professional in Baltimore, in a city that is right now racked with immense societal and social angst and the potential for amazing change within our community, we have the opportunity as a Jewish community to be on the forefront of that change. And if we're going to be a part of that change, we really have to step into the Mishkan Judaism ideals. And the way I like to think of it is that it's sort of cause-based Judaism, and that's how the community can sort of come together, as opposed to saying we are focused around a particular ideal, or we're focused around a particular place in the ground. One of the things that we can really rally around is the types of causes, the types of social initiatives that are critical to the community and critical to our local community, that the Torah and Tikun Olam tells us to focus on very heavily. And in that way, I think we can really be, we can reach out to the young members of the Jewish community who might otherwise feel a little bit disenfranchised by Temple Judaism, but desperately want to come out on a Sunday morning to put together care packages for homeless people to eat. And to me, that is no less Jewish than being in services on Friday night or Saturday morning. So I think that if we sort of change a little bit of what our focus is and what we categorize as a 10 out of 10 Jewish experience, we can capitalize on what is an amazing opportunity for us to be leaders in the community. And in many ways, we've already begun doing this. And Jessy does a tremendous amount of it, and the community itself does it. So I don't think that it has to be one where we choose one over the other. I think the community can be focused on those causes, and in doing so, we can still have those placeholders in the ground where we come together and congregate, but we don't have to lose the sense of the importance of our Judaism and our community orientation when we're out in the community focusing on causes that affect our local residents.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think one of the critiques, I would say, of this mode of thinking or mode of being when it comes to Jewish communal life is that maybe it feels a little thin, or Jessy, in your talk, you assert that Mishkan Judaism is more than clever programming, which is a great phrase, and I love it. And then you've got all these great examples of really rich experiences. And so, how does when you're talking about Mishkan Judaism, it seems like you're uprooting, right? It's not about being those rooted structures and having consistent community. It's more transient. It's more mobile. So how do you know there's something there? How do you know that there's something really meaty and deep happening beyond just a bunch of Jews getting together at a bar or whatever it may be?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And every time the Baltimore Jewish Times calls and asks for a quote, I'm sure to say that, this is all part of a whole. And I am working in, and I am funded to work in the area of outreach and engagement, and I think that that's a really necessary part of the whole of the Jewish community. But I will be the first one to say that showing up at a bar once a month with a mostly social primary forward is not necessarily sustainable for a long-term individual Jewish and spiritual journey, but also collective. And one of the vantage points that I have as being trained as a rabbi, having a master's in education, and also a really committed Jew who is just as much a teammate for the generations in front of us who are like, what are we going to do with these younger folks? And I'm also on the front lines of raising some of the criticisms and some of the frustrations that my peer group has. So I don't feel like I'm playing both sides of it as much as I feel like I really want to figure out how to fulfill that kind of like major task and charge that we have, which is in every generation to create a link that's strong enough to receive the generation that it's coming from, that is also going to be able to be strong enough to hold on, to be able to hold a link for a generation to come. You know, I often use the metaphor of crossing a river, and I think that most of the work that we are doing right now is creating the opportunity for people to see the immediate next stepping stones so that they prevent just looking at the kind of boulder that is the organized Jewish community on the other end of a river, that they're standing where they're standing and they're like, how the heck am I going to get there? And you can think about that in a lot of different ways. You can think about that in how you think about giving of tzedakah. You can think about that in how you think about just Jewish literacy. I think that there are some challenges in that this is not an end game on some level. This is a part of a process. And in the same way that the Mishkan model served to help a generation, one generation, right? A generation that in and of itself had to give way to the next generation before it could root itself again, that is really rich when I think about this kind of period of like unquestionable tumult and change we're in right now. And I think that, listen, it's very hard to measure when you're looking at driving data points of all of our successes. But I can give you anecdotal evidence on every single touch point that the people that I know that share with me sometimes losing sleep over what is it going to look like in the future could say, wow, this makes me feel like there's something there. Whether it is the opportunity to build relationships from the ground up, to really know the stories of people who are coming, and to be able to engage and even sometimes challenge the institutions that are prepared to receive them. I think a lot of our work in engagement and outreach is to figure out how to know those people really well so that they're real people, and how to use those experiences and those case studies as leverage to push our institutions to embark on this wave of change that is harder for the institutions that are more rooted than, say, me, Jessy, who, like, I can show up in a coffee shop in Canton at 12 o'clock, and then I can be in another coffee shop in Federal Hill by 2 o'clock, and I can meet 45 people at the bar at 5 o'clock. And my job and the job of my most esteemed kind of colleagues and lay leaders and core center folks who buy into this are people like Mark, who recognize that you don't need to hire a rabbi with a master's in education to throw happy hours once a month. That's not why the Baltimore Jewish community sought out to create a position that wanted somebody with my credentials, but to be able to bring Judaism and the toolboxes that I have to the individuals and the small groups that I'm working with, and to really challenge them where they're at, to go on a journey that we can walk on together for a little bit of time, while all the while engaging in conversation with those organizations and institutions that are kind of having to wait for people to either show up or to figure out what they can offer as the next steps. Well, then you just have this kind of connector model or this bridge model where, you know, my goal is to be able to start with Mark and be like, Mark, who are you and what are you about? And then for me to find the right moment to be like, there's Torah for that. And to figure out those moments where Mark's individual experience matches up with 5 or 6 other people I've had basically the same conversation with, and then to kind of do the work of bringing people together by gaining their trust and then engaging them in conversations that I want more than probably most to result in community conversations that show an investment of a generation that's still trying to find its voice, and to kind of test the hypothesis that for me, I think it's more just like of a framing model than it is like a content model. I believe that the Torah and the questions that the Torah pushes us to ask and Jewish tradition has challenged us to ask are more relevant now than I could ever imagine them being, and yet at the same time, I don't disagree with people who sometimes say they walk into a place, even a place that is expected to have a there, and wonder what that there is. The good news is that I don't think that this is something that like anybody could answer on their own. I think that part of the reason that this is such a fruitful, productive conversation and model right now here in Baltimore is because, I mean, everybody is involved in the conversation, whether they know it or not. And on some level, the reach that I and the community that is kind of enculturating itself to this model that we're putting out, I think it's amazing when I stop and think about how some of the most marginalized, checked out people don't even realize how closely in conversation they are with the folks who sit at the most central sources of funding and leadership in the current organized Jewish community. And that's, to me, where I'm inspired to kind of continue navigating. Like, okay, I see that boulder over there that the whole Jewish community wants us to get everyone to stand on. I see a lot of people standing on this side of the riverbank that are like, okay, I see it, but like, what do I have to step on to get there? And their conversations about Judaism as a whole, their conversations about the Judaism that I think I know, their conversations about literacy and foundations strong enough to take those steps. And the good news is I get to have them over infinite cups of coffee, but the challenge for me and for Mark and for our center set of folks who really think about this is, how do you extend it beyond any one person? How do you use community organizing as a model to create some sort of critical mass of people who understand how to articulate who they are and where they're coming from and are open to engaging with potential next steps? And most of that happens through relationships, which I feel really lucky is like the focus of most of the work that we're doing.
I love this idea of framing and the stories and kind of story weaving. I love your phrase, there's Torah for that. And this also sounds really exhausting. Are you worried about like burnout? I mean, how do you maintain that kind of momentum and that level of depth with every individual person who comes through these different places that you're using as your framework?
Infinite cups of coffee, I think.
I don't actually drink coffee even. It's always tea. I mean, listen, this is a marathon, and if I were the type of person that could just be happy as an interior designer, God knows I would have done it. But I care so deeply about the Jewish people. I love Torah and the stories inside of it. And for me personally, it has always been an alternative option to this like massively individualistic consumer capitalist society that I keep getting told left and right like there's no other option. But Judaism in every generation has been an option. It's been an alternative. It is a framework in which I get to like confidently say, I'm not the center of the universe. Something greater than me is. And it is a framework that has constantly caused me to be able to say, my individual hopes and dreams alone are only valid within the context of some sort of community conversation. And everything I make is not for me. That's thousands of years of our story. And for me personally, I'd rather fight tooth and nail to advocate for that story at a time when, you know, I saw a meme the other day. It was joking football's about to get started, and I love football, although I struggle with my love of football. But there was this meme that was like, my football team loses, the coach makes a bad call, I'm giving up my seats, and I'm done with it. And it was really a joke on church and synagogue affiliation, right? Like, there is something that is incongruent about like the real joy and the real reward of Jewish tradition and Torah that is somehow like it's not being given like the right rap. And I don't know if that's Hollywood, I don't know if that's Hebrew school, I don't know what that is, but I believe that my own journey led me to want to learn as much as possible. And that's why when I say there's Torah for everything and I have this hypothesis, like I believe that it's in there. I think that the hard work to do is convincing people to open up their like curiosity and their awe and their mindsets enough to like give it a chance. And I don't know. I mean, part of what like counters the potential burnout is I believe in it, and the option of giving up on it is giving into nothing matters but me and my own sense of self. And I'd much rather live in a world where I believe that there's a greater purpose, even if it doesn't make sense to me how it works, than in a world where there's nothing greater. And I really actually believe that no matter what you call it, human beings crave community and relationship and have spiritual cravings. So I don't know, it's like the little red hen story, like where that hen was just like making bread and nobody wanted to like thresh the flour and nobody wanted to like knead the dough, but as soon as they smelled the bread, everybody wanted a piece of it. So the truth is, I'm not alone. Like, there are so many of us making ourselves move from individual relationships to collective whole is a challenge, but I don't know any community organizer who's trying to affect change in any area who doesn't struggle with that. And I'm really moved by the fact that in every city, like, I'm not doing anything in Baltimore that someone else didn't model for me in San Francisco or Los Angeles. Or, I mean, I have colleagues that are on any given day ready to like share the headbanging experience of trying to make change, but it's rewarding. And like, when I can't sleep at night because I don't know how we're gonna do, I counter it by like I sleep better at night because, you know, it feels like some of us have to take on this task. And I'm really grateful that I feel like I'm in like a really good chevre and group of people who, whether they like it or not, like they feel like they're on for the ride. I do think we have big questions to answer, and I think the scariest thing is like we don't actually know what it's gonna look like. But my issue, like there's so many, my issue for the Jewish people is Jewish competency and confidence and literacy. So I know that I have an entire career worth of time to spend on that because I think that in the long term we really need to like know our Jewish tradition if we're going to make conscious choices about how to lift it up authentically in the framework and time we're living in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds like that stepping stone approach that you were talking about earlier is part of that as well, right? Sort of taking it like this is the next step and this is the next step. But I'd love to, Mark, let me throw it over to you real quick. We're living in an era where if we take Jessy's analogy, we're living in an era where Mishkan times and temple times are coexisting, which we don't have a biblical model for. It was Mishkan, and then it got more rooted, and then we had temple times, and so on and so forth. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what it means for Mishkan Judaism and temple Judaism to be coexisting, what it means for the community, and maybe what it means for leadership as well.
It's all about people and what we do as a community to react to it, because on one hand Mishkan Judaism and temple Judaism can be mutually exclusive if we allow them to be, but they don't have to be if we as a community react to them in a way that makes the best out of the situation. And what Jessy was just mentioning is that I think what concerns a lot of people in the community is the idea that we don't know exactly where this is leading. We don't know exactly where this path is going to take us and sort of what the end point of this conversation is. I personally think that that's the best part, because that means that we as a community and as the people of the community get to play a critical role in directing the future of the Jewish community in America and around the world. And what Jessy was saying about the idea that there's Torah there in everything, that for me is exactly where the two sort of entities come together, because the idea that there is Torah in this moment means that the moment can be anywhere at any time, as long as we're understanding what the lesson from that moment is. That doesn't mean that any less has to be in a temple or synagogue or shul, however you use the terminology, or has to be not there, has to be in a coffee shop or in a soup kitchen or in a bar. To me, it's more about the moment. And I think that that's how we can really break down the barriers that we often have in the Jewish community. So, for example, if you think about the elderly couple who are sitting on the board of a Jewish community somewhere, who are big financial givers, have been tied into the community for 50 years, they go to synagogue, they have their tickets for high holidays, they are your tried and true temple Judaism couple. To them, when they're sitting on the board of that organization and giving money and giving of their time, it's because at the end of the day, they want a part of that to go to helping homeless people in the community, or helping local kids with education issues learn to read better, or to providing a Jewish education for their grandchildren, which includes those ideals of helping the homeless and being a positive actor of societal change. Well, by the same token, if you look at that 25-year-old kid who feels completely disenfranchised with the organized Jewish community and doesn't want to go to temple and thinks that that is a structure that has nothing to do with them, well, a lot of times that kid on the weekend is helping out at a homeless shelter, right? That kid is in a school giving of their time to teach little kids in the school how to read. I see it all the time. So what are we doing? We're both in this together for the ideals of what Tikun Olam teaches us. We both sort of are on this track where we want to make the world a better place. Well, there's the Torah there, right? Because at the end of the day, whether it's, at least to me, whether it's sitting on the board of the organization or whether you're a 25-year-old kid giving up your time on a Sunday morning in an inner city school, the concept is the same. The reason is the same. The cause is the same. And so in that way, we as the culture, as the society, have the ability to move things forward to say, we can have both. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, because at the end of the day, it's the learning experience, it's the Torah, it's the way that we as Jews give back to the world and to society that makes us who we are and makes us a community that no matter what happens to us over time, over centuries, we will always be there. And it's because those ideals are at the heart of everything we do. Whether you're sitting in temple or whether you're sitting in a bar, that's not going to change. So I think that the lack of clarity as to where this is going to go allows us to say, okay, perfect. A lack of clarity gives us the opportunity to step into that vacuum and say, this is what the future of Judaism can be, and it has to be no less Torah-based, no less temple-based, and no less Mishkan-based, because it's about the ideals. It's about the moments, about Jessy being able to say, there's Torah there, wherever the there is.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to create kind of a foundation in which people feel like they know that Torah, right? Like
Yes.
every morning in our daily prayers, we talk about these 10 things that you do really to be a mensch, to like be a good member of society, and then we say, and the study of Torah is equal to them all, or counters them all, or scratches the back of them all. And that's my answer to like, why did the Jewish community hire a rabbi, right? like if this was really just about programming, then hire a great programmer. And I happen to think I am one, but this wouldn't have been a job for me or for them in the long run, which I believe it is in a lot of ways, if it was just about that. It's being able to, I say this all the time, I feel like my job, if we're going to be outside of these traditional spaces, is to create as many Jacob wrestling with the angel moments as possible. To be able to be standing over a pint of beer or a cup of coffee, and for someone to have a moment where they say, oh, there's something here and I didn't realize it. Or for someone to be able to take that Sunday morning decision to use their time to volunteer before they get home to watch the Ravens game, right? Like on a sacred day of the calendar, and for them to be able to make a mental note that this is a mitzvah in addition to just like a humanitarian good deed. That's my job. That's our job, of those of us who kind of can make that particular case in those otherwise universal moments. But it's amazing, actually. Like, there's not time and there's not a chart to show you the impact. But I just even think about, like, last week, some of the things that happened as a result of my ability to kind of navigate individual relationships and Jewish journeys with institutional Jewish intentions, to be welcoming, to be inclusive, to give people the necessary steps they made. And I look at last week and like we had some major successes. It may not go beyond 1 or 2 people at any given moment, but if I were to share with you just an example of some of those, you would see they have ripple effects that I believe will make our Jewish institutions and their process to engage the Jewish community as the way it looks today in a meaningful way. We're making inroads, and in that respect, that agility, that iterative nature of how we are able to do it because we're kind of in the trenches on a daily basis, I mean, it's inspiring. And that's one of the reasons that there's not burnout. Some of the things that we've been able to do, it may not go at this moment beyond 1 or 2 people, but you know, sometimes people are like, oh, well, you have this such alternative job as a rabbi. I'm still working with people who are in spiritual crises and struggling to make meaning of their life. I'm still navigating people who are on a journey towards Judaism, how to fit into the Jewish collective. I'm still navigating how we're going to ever create an infrastructure that can actually pay for the things that people are kind of enculturated to just expect. I mean, it's all in there. Every single day it feels like all of those different classes I took in rabbinical school, there's a touch point. And my job is really to learn as much as I can about Jewish tradition so that when somebody like Mark says, oh, I do this, this, and this, I can say, wow, do you know that in the Torah, you know, this is what we say? Or do you know that the rabbis had the same question? I don't believe in God. I love being Jewish, but I'm not religious. Guess what? The rabbis were debating that in the 6th century. So welcome to the conversation. Take part in the conversation.
So I'd love to, we'll take a couple more minutes. I'd love to wrap up with some more thoughts on leadership and what this requires from both professional leadership and from volunteer leadership. And Jessy, what you're suggesting is that, I mean, I hear you speak and you just reverberate passion and enthusiasm for all of this, but also deep, deep knowledge, which is something that you've touched on along the way. So it sounds like a real requirement or a prerequisite to building Mishkan Judaism that works and that reverberates and that allows you to see those ripples of impact requires that belly full of Torah, you know, requires that real depth of knowledge and immersion in the tradition. But what else? I mean, what does leadership for change look like, both on the professional side and on the volunteer or follower side?
Well, on one hand you say what else, but I would initially and kind of crassly respond like that's everything. Like I think, you know, my colleagues who are working in synagogues, they're trying to agitate and they're trying to ruffle the feathers just in the buildings that they're doing. There's a bar mitzvah revolution taking place right now. You know, I believe strongly that one of the greatest gifts of getting to work with young adults right now is that you can talk about all the good stuff once you're an adult. I mean, really, think about it. How backwards is it that in American Jewish community, on some level, the bar mitzvah is an exit ramp to the point where you get to decide whether you keep going to Hebrew school or not, versus the on-ramp to some sort of understanding of responsibility to be more than just for yourself and like in a mature way. I mean, I'm a Purim Jew and I can have a lot of fun with it, but I think that's one of the coping mechanisms because it really is everything on some level. I think that our Jewish tradition gives us examples of the kind of qualities I would love our leaders to have. I mean, you look at the debates between Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai, and I know that so many people have no idea who those people are, but if they had any idea the level and the degree to which those two men debated for the sake of the Jewish people, it would be a model for us that we don't necessarily all have to have a unilateral approach to what it means to do Judaism. I loved rabbinic literature in rabbinic school. I still do. And, you know, there's this joke, like, how much does a Reform rabbi really need to know the rabbinic legal codes? Because while deeply committed to Jewish tradition, not acting necessarily in this, like, legal framework as a way of expressing your Judaism, some could argue. So who cares? You want the best example of, like, what it means to have holy debate about topics that you don't agree on and to to emphasize that the debate and the process of debate is actually more important than the outcome, you just have to look at our history. And so for me, part of the challenge is people don't have the confidence to do that. So here I am, I'm a rabbi with a little bit of a toolkit. So if I come to you and I say, oh, there's stuff there, that's one thing. But it's kind of, you know, like that highest rung of the tzedakah ladder. Like, if I'm just telling you that, it's not helping to cultivate your confidence. But if over that cup of coffee or over that pint of beer or in those small group settings where we're bringing people together, we're talking about what are the tools that you need to be able to say, I am rooted authentically in tradition and I'm still advocating for this way of change. I do think, to specifically like answer your question, is, you know, I feel really excited that like in every generation you need some different things. And I think that, listen, our tradition is a song, and anybody who loves music on the level that I know Mark and I and Miriam, you do, we all do, I know this about us, you can't sing the song, never mind think about the implications of like the lyrics or the actual instrumentation if you don't have a familiarity with it. But if you can internalize a song, you can sing it wherever you are. You don't even need the song to be playing in the background. And it's not a dumbing down of the power of Torah. It's actually a very perfect analogy. And so I think having the leaders who are not afraid of the fact that those stepping stones could lead us to a little bit of a Jewish infrastructure in the future than what we are now, I think that's helpful. I mean, I have senior colleagues in town. They're not the ones that are scared about the trends of synagogue affiliation. It's my colleagues who are my contemporaries, because my senior colleagues recognize that things are changing, but they have that same degree of confidence that it's not Judaism that's irrelevant, but we are in this process of change that may look the opposite of building social halls and building extravagant buildings. I think there's a real pain and a real fear in what does it mean if we downsize the number of institutional places we have, or what does it mean if the majority of progressive Jews who were born 1980 or above are not going to look for a senior facility that has a kosher kitchen. Those are real questions. They can be really painful questions. It doesn't mean Judaism's over. It doesn't mean Torah is irrelevant. But there are moments and there are points of tension where the long-run sustainability of the Jewish people and the Jewish infrastructure are called into question. And I think the more that we build relationships with each other, the more that we go through processes to be able to articulate who we are as an individual, what we stand for in community, the more we'll actually see, like Mark said earlier, the universality of our values at play. And then I think then you have those people who are able to put the particularities of Judaism into it. You know, I say community organizing is a model because I think that it really starts from the person, but it ends in an attempt to organize power and organize people to be able to articulate themselves, to make changes, to be able to make the systems and institutions that they go into better represent who's on the ground looking to step in. And so in that respect, I think it's very different than some of, you know, the rabbis who were senior rabbis when I was a kid, who, by the way, they're the people who influenced me. I'm not saying that their way of doing things is in any way inferior to what we're doing. It was just a different time. We wanted our rabbis to give a 30-minute sermon and to show us kind of maybe what we couldn't do for ourselves. That's not Judaism. Judaism is upon each individual to learn as much as he or she can and to act on his or her agency in the world in a way that has a semblance of Jewish understanding. So I think there are many models for leadership, but I just think that as we move into this more murky, messy time, we need people who are a little more comfortable being murky and messy in it, especially if you're going to be outside of a traditional space to do that work.
Mm-hmm. Mark, thoughts on what that means for lay leadership or volunteers? What's the responsibility of folks who aren't necessarily doing this in a professional capacity?
Two things. I guess everybody's responsibility is a little bit different. The first is for folks that I think understand the paradigm shift and the importance of what Jesse's saying, in that it doesn't mean what we're losing is Judaism or the importance of Torah. It just means it's going to be accepted and learned and comprehended and appreciated in different spaces. It is incumbent on us to make sure that the rest of the community understands that there is still the option for Jewish learning everywhere, and it doesn't have to be in the physical structure. And if you want it in the physical structure, that's where it can be, but that's not the only place that it is. And I think that those of us that appreciate that, understand the importance of that, and see where the general idea of where the shift is going, and feel comfortable enough in that messiness and murkiness as I do, it's incumbent on us to do everything that we can to guide the rest of the community into that uncertain while simultaneously beautiful future. The second part of it is the relationships, the partnerships. That, at the end of the day, to me, is where the most beautiful part of the Torah is, whatever that relationship might be. So, what Jessy was saying about us, having an event the last week or so, and maybe it will only affect one or two people. But for those one or two people, that could be the changing of their whole world to what they thought was a scenario or a community that they were completely disenfranchised by, that they might now find a place and find a home in. And for me personally, that's everything. On that personal level, that is more than anywhere else where the Torah is, because that bringing other people into the fold, allowing them to see everything that there is to be seen, and to enjoy being a part of that future with us, where it is at times uncertain, but gives us an opportunity to affect society in such a positive way through the causes that we're involved in. That is probably the most important place where I see, particularly for lay leadership to be involved, volunteer leadership to be involved, and where we can really affect the most change. Because the more of those individuals that we can bring into the picture, every time we change one of their lives, it simultaneously changes ours. And
that's Torah, by the way, right? Like the
exactly.
rabbis teach us, right? You destroy one life, it's a whole universe, and likewise,
yeah.
It's
100%. And I think that is where we as volunteer leadership need to realize that our focus can and should be. It's in partnerships with people like Jessy, which is frankly the easiest thing I could ever possibly have to do. And then it's in partnership with people that it's a little bit more difficult to be in partnership with, that see Judaism as a form of organized Judaism that they don't want to be a part of. And it's that process of slowly teaching and learning and bringing them into the fold and opening their eyes to all of the beautiful things that there is. And it doesn't have to be in those traditional structures, doesn't have to be in those traditional power structures. That is, I think, the most important role that the leadership can play, which is bringing the rest of the community into what it is that we can all be doing together. And of course, as Jessy says, there is absolutely Torah there.
I want to just say one last thing. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, is that role that hope and faith play. And I think that I have no doubt that people still in their private spaces grapple with their own faith or what they believe in. And I can tell you almost on cue, at the point in a conversation where someone is going to differentiate between their spirituality and their belief in God and all of these things that's, are fascinating to me. But the whole idea of the Israelites wandering in the desert, the whole thing that they had going for them was that they had to have, it was a leap of faith, right? And that's where the talk ends. There were moments where they wanted to go back to Egypt, and Egypt seems like the least ideal scenario anyone could imagine. So something about that uncertainty, something about that not knowing had to be scarier than even the idea of being an oppressed people under Pharaoh's rule. And I think that there is an interesting, unique challenge at this time and place we're living in right now, where we can turn on the television or turn on Facebook in order to, in theory, quiet those kind of questions of the unknown and the uncertain that are basic human questions that require an engagement with some degree of what do I believe in and what do I hope for and what is my faithful steps. And so whether it's professional or lay, I think there's also an interesting challenge of we have to figure out, even if it's not in a traditional form, the role that faith in the steps you take within uncertainty could arrive you at a promised land, and that, like, we're going to walk there together, and, you know, maybe it will be our generation, maybe it will be the next generation, but our models and our tradition show us that faith is a necessary component to that recipe for success. And so again, on some level, the tradition and the role that, like, our own ability to submit to that which is not clearly delineated in front of us is something that on either side of it has to be a part of that process.
Beautiful. I think it's a great message to end on. And I want to, first of all, thank you both. Thank you, Jessy. Thank you, Mark, for being part of this conversation, for facilitating a moment of wrestling with the angel and sharing your ideas and building the community that you are in Baltimore. We wish you nothing but success. Thank you all for watching. More to come from ELI Talks. Check out Jessy's talk. Check out some of the other ones. We've got some great moments of wrestling happening there. ELITalks.org. And if I don't talk to you before then, Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova. Have a great year. Lots of good things to look forward to. Lots of challenges and opportunities. Let's wrestle with them and make it happen. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.